Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Today, we're going to talk about career education with an expert who's dedicating his career to this field. I'm joined today by Edson Barton, who's the co-founder and CEO of YouScience. We're going to get into a lot of the interesting work that Edson's doing, get some of his perspective. Before we do any of that, Edson, welcome to Trending in Education.
Man, Michael, thank you so much. I appreciate being here and look forward to the conversation.
As do I. And as your rite of initiation here, we like to hear in your own words, your origin story, what got you to this point in your professional life. Can you catch us up on how you got to this point in your career?
Yeah, you bet. And it's actually part of the story of the company as well. And so I was not a very good student. We'll just put it that way, growing up. And part of it started, I had a sister that passed away when I was 8 years old. She was 13. Very traumatic, of course, for our family.
Yeah.
And during that time, I fell behind in school. And I didn't recognize that as the problem at the time, but that was kind of the core of it. And at one point in time, during my second grade year, this other second grade girl comes up to me and says, "Hey, you're not very good at math, And because I just failed the quiz or something. And the sad thing about that, and she wasn't trying to do any harm, of course, but the sad thing about that was that it stuck with me. And the truth is I was behind, and catching up in the system that we have is very difficult. And I had very dedicated, wonderful teachers, but it's just hard. And so growing up, I had this perception of who I was. And on the other hand, I was very good at art. And so growing up from a very young age, everybody would emphasize that about me, probably because I was failing on my other side.
Yeah.
And so I really leaned into that. And, I ended up earning kind of A's or D's because if I was interested in the subject, I did well. If not, I was just do the bare minimum to get by. Well, growing up through that, you feel like you're alone. You feel like you're the one and only that fits in that category. And carrying that all the way through to college became a problem. And at some point, of course, I started to realize, wait a second, that's not really true. That's not who I am.
Yeah.
I'm more than that. And as I started to explore and understand better, that's where I started to figure out, okay, I have capabilities that are way beyond what I thought I had. And as I started to dive into this area and really try to figure out, okay, why did I feel that way? Right? I started to realize I wasn't alone. Actually, I was in the vast majority of people, and it's the very few of us that actually feel successful going through the education system the way that it's designed.
Right.
And by the way, I believe very much in our education system. We have the very best education system in the entire world. I've been fortunate to travel around and study those different education systems, and we truly have the best. So as I kind of came out of that period, I decided I really wanted to focus on figuring that out. What would it be? What is the thing that will help engage students better in their education so that they find joy and passion in it rather than just skating through, kind of hoping that they'll someday find a good job.
Yeah.
And at the end of all of the research, and there's lots of stories that go around that, but at the end, it just came down to this very simple thing. Career-connected learning improves everything about an individual's education. And not just their education, but everything about their lives. It's one of those key salient points that if we can really help somebody focus on, it makes a world of difference. Not just a little bit, but by a lot.
And then that led to YouScience, where you co-founded that and you've been running. It's been around for a little while. Can you tell the story of YouScience?
Yeah, you bet. So I actually founded a company called Precision Exams. And the reason why I was interested in that, going back to that story of mine, was because I participated in a survey. I worked with Microsoft for years, and they did a survey about the impact of certifications on students in the classroom. They wanted to know, does it really have any type of benefit just beyond, the recognition of a certification? And what they came to find out was that, yes, that connection, that one intervention of adding a certification into a high school class actually improved GPA, it improved attendance rates, it improved high school graduation, college enrollment. It really just had this host of benefits. And that intrigued me very deeply, especially because of my story that I told you.
Yeah.
So I latched onto that and tried to build a company that would do that. The problem with that was the certifications are a trailing indicator of success. You go through the entire process and then finally take a certification. So while the connection there to industry started to become real, I started wondering, how do we get more students into pathways so that they can take advantage of this great benefit?
Hmm.
And so I started exploring really very legitimately, every guidance program out there. I've taken hundreds of interest and
Yeah.
personality tests.
You know what color your parachute is?
Yeah. And the problem with those is that they are very good, very valid tools. But if you use those tools singularly for guidance purposes to career, they're actually kind of garbage.
Mhm.
And they actually end up doing more harm than they do good for people. And that's a very bold statement, but the problem is that you can't have an interest in something that you've never understood
Right.
or if you've never experienced. So all
No,
of those tests are,
they're kind of like a blunt instrument, right? Like
yeah,
they're not.
that's, yeah, using a hammer to drill in a screw, it just doesn't work well.
Mhm.
And there are reasons that maybe we can talk about. But through that process, I kept just not finding the right thing that really made a difference. The outcomes weren't there for those tools. And then I came across a company called YouScience, and they were fairly new. So my company got started in 2006. At the time, YouScience had started in 2013, and
Okay.
originally they were more of a consumer product, trying to go out to the market and just offer their wares. But when I came across them, and I met them at a conference, and as I sat down with them to understand what they were doing, immediately I knew that this was different.
Mhm.
And the true difference is that it follows aptitudes and assesses true performance aptitudes rather than asking you what your opinion is about yourself.
Right.
And so it was fundamentally different. We're the only company in the world that we know of that actually offers aptitude assessments online in a mass format.
Hmm.
And that's incredible because usually it's done one-on-one. It's very expensive, $500 to
Right.
$1,000.
Mhm.
And so we were able to figure out how to put that online and make it available. So at that time, that was in 2018. And throughout the end of that year in 2019, we talked about merging companies.
Hmm.
We merged companies right before COVID hit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the rest is history.
And I guess the name You Science, it's not really about science, it's about you. It's the science of you. Is that the
That's right.
idea? Got it.
Exactly. And it's very incredibly scientific based,
Hmm.
which is why we named it that. But it is just that. It's that science of you really trying to help you figure out that pathway that will lead
Mm.
to your best success.
That makes sense. And I guess it's connecting to your point, it's connecting not just your interests, but also your aptitudes, like where you're excelling and where you have some talent, perhaps. And as someone who worked for 20 plus years at Kaplan Test Prep, I certainly understand the space around these types of assessments that are out there and, you know, what you can learn versus what you have in terms of your innate ability. How about on the assessment side? Like what's involved in the test and what's sort of the psychometrics or like the work that happens on the back end to make sure that you're giving people reliable recommendations?
Yeah. And that's true across all of our products. So we still offer certifications today. In fact, we have the largest library of certifications for the entry to mid-level employment areas than
Interesting.
anybody else in the country. That's important too for the kind of that connection to career.
Hmm.
But the psychometrics on the aptitude piece, which are fascinating, and I won't get too wonky here, but the science is based on over 70 years of research through a foundation called the Ball Foundation. And they've been a pioneer in aptitude research since that time when really the aptitude kind of concept started kicking in for people.
Hmm.
And so the science is really based on all of that longitudinal data that they've been collecting over that time and that they still continue to collect. just a wonderful organization that's really been dedicated to this. And so we were able to work with them and say, okay, well, how do we take this, which is, a lot of times it was very hands-on, performance-based, or, looking at the interviewer, this PhD sitting on the other side,
Yeah.
and you did all these things with them, and then they would evaluate you and help you understand your aptitudes and then how that connected to your future.
Right.
And we were able to synthesize and figure out how to get those activities down in a psychometrically valid way online, where they were being performed in a way that we could compare the results to the live results. And our results are actually amazing. They're 98% accurate to the same activities that they would do right there in person, which, statistically speaking, is just a couple of degrees off from perfect.
Right.
And that meant a lot to us. And so as we were able to do this, we were really able to hone this down and make sure that we can offer it in a timely way for everybody. And that's
Right.
really what our goal is, to make sure that everybody has access to this tool.
Yeah. And there's a movement in K-12 specifically around career and technical education. You mentioned career connected learning, which I kind of prefer that language. But the idea that starting early, and as a parent of a 6-year-old, I'm already starting to think about this. Lego sets are kind of modeling who you might become in the future. How do you think about sort of weaving this in as early as possible and kind of integrating perhaps changes to the curriculum or ways in which we think about early childhood education right through K-12 into post-secondary? Sounds like connecting this to a career and connecting it to better metrics and better guidance around who you are and what you might excel at. That's kind of the missing piece of the puzzle. How do you think about integrating that back into our existing systems?
Yeah, great question. And it's a very complex question, of course. And so I'll try to answer it more simply. And if we have time, we can go into more detail. But the truth is that we found out that you really need to start career information and career guidance as early as possible. Now, there's some challenges with that I'll talk about, but first let me talk about the other side of this. For generations now, we have really focused on career, mostly for students coming out of college,
Mhm.
right? You go into college, and we've been pushing everybody to college, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we're pushing everybody there. And then we're just saying kind of blindly, pick a major,
Yeah.
where there's never been a real focus of that. And so you're picking a major, not because a major is important. You're picking a major because that leads to a career.
Mhm.
But we don't really talk very much, or we haven't through the past talked about, okay, well, what career should I be doing? How do I do that? And so you ended up really, all of the work that was around workforce development was happening at the end of college. And it is very inefficient and ineffective. Just over time, it's estimated somewhere between about 25% all the way up to 75% of college graduates will never work in a field related to their major. I
Wow.
mean, think about that. Even if it's on the 25% range, which there are some very excellent studies that show it's on the 75% range,
Mhm.
that's terrible.
Mhm.
Those are results that nobody should be willing to accept.
Right.
And it really, as we kind of analyze and understand this, it comes back down to, okay, am I picking something that actually means something to me? Is it a career? Is it a major that
Right.
I can focus on and fulfill?
Mhm.
Again, bringing that down, we need to bring it down as close to as we can, the younger and younger. The challenge with doing it early, in years like with your son, meaning pick a career kind of thing,
Right.
is that you really have no idea who that 6-year-old really is at that point.
Mhm.
It is very hard to measure true aptitudes at that young age. You can
Mhm.
do it with
Mhm.
pretty good validity, but it's still really tough.
Right.
So the best thing to do when somebody is young is not to ask them, what are you interested in? Because a 6-year-old is going to be interested in the most recent thing that they were exposed to, right?
Right. Right.
And whatever's cool about that, right? So that is kind of their world. And if you start reinforcing that too soon, just like I did when I was, right around that age, and I said, I'm not good at math,
Mm-hmm.
that was a negative reinforcement, but you can do positive reinforcement that actually can be fairly negative in the long run.
Mm.
Now, on the positive side for me, I was constantly told I was great at art, and I was, and I built up that skill on top of my aptitudes. But when it came time, I actually got an offer for a full ride scholarship for art. And luckily, I think in my life, I realized that while I loved it, and I still do today, it didn't fulfill me
Mm.
in a way that I really needed. And I recognized that. And so I kind of pulled back away and I never took that scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not the best idea, too, in some ways, to pay for college, even if I would have changed.
Right.
But yeah, that was a mental model that I'd built up of myself. And I just, kind of pounded that home. The best time to really start this process is in the middle school years
Mm-hmm.
because the individual is more developed at that point. They're starting to look at their world a little bit more broadly, and they're starting to recognize there's more careers out there than just the things that they recognize already.
Yeah.
It's still very limited, but it is a time where you can start to make an impact and expand their world to things that they've never even thought of before.
Right.
That's where we first do our first aptitude test, is at that level.
Mm-hmm.
Then we recommend that individuals do it again as they get into high school, right at the ninth grade, 10th grade year, because your aptitudes actually solidify going through
Mm.
that puberty process. And then they don't really change through adulthood. Your aptitudes are what they are.
Right.
Your interests still continue to change from day to day.
Yeah. Well, and then also you have interesting research that you put out recently, the 2025 State of the Future U.S. Workforce Report, endorsed by nonprofit Skills USA. But like you are keeping track of what's happening in the actual job market, which is the other part of the equation. So I think thus far we've been talking about it more from the perspective of the learner and maybe their school system and like how they optimally could be assessed along the way so that they can understand where they might excel, but they don't know what they don't know. And there's been increasing disruption within the labor markets where certain areas are popping, other things are getting disrupted. We made it this far without talking about AI, but there I went ahead and did it. There are places where jobs are changing, and I do a number of conversations in the workforce space, and I'm always struck by the lack of visibility around opportunities, unfilled jobs, even in your current region, in your location that you really could be great at, but you don't know about it and you don't necessarily have the sort of finishing skills to really be relevant there. Can you talk a little bit about the report and maybe more the workforce side of the equation? Because that mapping, I imagine, has gotten a little bit more complicated as skills and parts of the labor market have been disrupted lately.
Yeah. That is such an important question. The report is called the 2025 State of the Future Workforce Report. And we try to do an annualized report, get those out there to see if there's shifting things that are happening in the economy and with our workforce. But, one of the premise of the report is that there is this huge gap that you identified between what we know as an individual. And even if I'm out of a job and looking desperately, between what I know and what's available to me. And it's a huge gap. And it's worse with some populations than others, as you can imagine. But, when you have a gap in the understanding that you have the capabilities, the aptitudes to accomplish jobs in the healthcare industry or construction or in IT or, you name it. And then the job fulfillment is way higher. For example, there's a 28% gap in people who have the aptitude to do healthcare careers versus those who have the interest in those
Mm.
healthcare
Hmm.
careers.
Hmm.
That's dramatic. And if we could shift just even a fraction of that population more towards those careers because it naturally fits them, that actually changes our economy in dramatic ways.
Yeah.
Helps this labor problem. Economists have really said for years, and this isn't new, but we're now hitting the critical point that there was going to be this gap in employment that's now happening, and it's just going to get worse. And so we have to solve that, or else our economy will falter in really significant ways, and prices will continue to just rise like crazy. We all
Right.
see it in the construction. So if you've been trying to buy a home recently, the prices of homes just over in every part of the country have skyrocketed. And it's because of the shortage of work. One of the reasons is because of the shortage of workers in construction, which are amazing, fantastic jobs that are paying incredible wages, but people don't really know that that's a job that they could or should excel at.
Right.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. The other side is what you mentioned, and it deals with a little bit with AI, is the skill gap that's starting to form. Every job, and literally every job, is becoming increasingly more difficult to do, or more technical, I should say. In
Yeah.
fact, just before we started the program, you had mentioned, a little bit of having to increase your knowledge on some ways to do the podcast.
Yeah.
And my father was a truck driver, as an example, and a wonderful man, did a wonderful career, loved him dearly, provided for us amazingly. But the skill to do a driving job, even as a long distance truck driver, was pretty low.
Mm.
We know that those jobs are going to go away, those driving jobs.
Mhm.
But economists have actually said that there will be as many or maybe even more jobs than there were before, but they're going to change in nature. They're going to be technician jobs. They're going to be engineering jobs. They're going to be road service jobs, right? The skill went from here to here,
Mhm.
almost the same type of career.
Right.
So we've got to be able to help people find their way to their best fit aptitudes, because then they can shift as the economy shifts. They're not so focused on, I am only good at this one job.
Right.
Now they can take a step back and they can say, oh, I have these natural talents. And those talents can actually apply to this job, that job, that job, that job. And even if it's in the one job area that I was, and that job really changes because of AI or something else, I can understand, okay, if I pivot just like this, then I can actually be very successful still.
Yeah.
Or if I can learn to take advantage of AI, then I can still apply the very best of who I am to the world of work around me.
Mhm.
So we're actually able to give individuals a greater view of who they are personally and what they're capable of. And that helps them transition more effectively through the rest of their lives.
Yeah. You mentioned, guidance counselors and career counselors. It does seem like there is a gap there as well, where how do you find the mentor? Raj Shetty's work on social capital is something we talk about a lot, but it's also why career days at school are actually kind of important, just so that folks realize, oh, I could do that for a living. How do you see that kind of playing out in terms of maybe changing the focus of our educational system so that folks are almost marketed to some extent? Like, it seems like if you talk about healthcare or IT, some of the architecture, some of the jobs that are listed in your report, it may be that people don't realize there's a future there, and they also might not realize that they could actually be great, that they have some of those aptitudes, although aptitude's kind of a charged word, and I want to make sure I give you a chance to defend it. But before we get into that, I'm more curious, like, what's missing that is creating these gaps, and what are some interventions that you think might help us get on a better track with this?
Yeah, I think the gaps have been created in large part because as an education system, as we've evolved from, 100 years ago plus, we've evolved into this nature of saying education is important for its own self.
I
It's
see.
an end unto itself, which to some degree is true. And I think everybody kind of agrees with that. But as you remove the why out of education, why am I personally doing and studying what I'm doing? Then all of a sudden you remove the relevance, you remove the purpose, you remove then the drive
Yeah.
that gives somebody the way forward. So now as you play that into counseling, for example, we've burdened our counselors so far away from actually counseling students and helping them.
Mhm.
It's really probably 50% plus. In fact, we're going to launch another report here soon focusing on counselors, but they're struggling. They're spending 50% plus doing compliance activities
Mm.
and reporting that has almost no direct value to the students or to the community.
Mm.
That's a tragedy.
Yeah.
So if that's going to continue, which I hope it doesn't, we need to help the counselors be more efficient with the time that they do have with the students.
I see.
And that's where this connection with workforce, your aptitudes, your interests, the schooling that you're getting, and then the workforce becomes very powerful.
Mhm.
We started the conversation around career connected learning improves everything.
Yeah.
Um, and if you line this up really nicely through our education system, then it has powerful effects. So we shouldn't remove business from our schools. And it doesn't mean that they're in there nefariously. And I think that's probably a very big misperception about what happens. As you actually leverage businesses to come in and help train the students, help them see the possibilities of what's available to them, everything gets better with their education. They
Mhm.
learn faster, the students, they grow faster, they graduate at higher rates, they go to college at much higher rates. And most importantly, they finish college at higher rates. I mean, if we want to change the future of how education works, then we need to be partnering with businesses more effectively and bringing them into the classroom. The
Mm.
way to do it, though, is to really make sure that we're identifying the right students for the right types of businesses. And
Mhm.
that's where aptitudes can really play a very strong role. If I can identify and say, okay, hey, Michael, you would be an incredible manufacturing engineer, right? Or mechanical engineer and other careers as well, but we'll just focus on that one. Then we can invite businesses in, not to talk to the whole population of students. Maybe that's kind of fun, but it's very ineffective. But now they can come in and talk to you and some of your peers that fit that kind of category.
Mhm.
And then they can say, hey, we actually are Texas Instruments
Mm.
or, pick a chip manufacturer, Intel or NVIDIA, right? Which is in the news so much right now.
Right.
And we have amazing jobs for mechanical engineers.
Mhm.
And we would like to have you work for us someday. Now, here's the pathway that you're going to need to come and work for us. But you, Michael, have the talent to do it.
Right.
Think about what that does for a kid, right?
Mhm.
Not just talking to a population at an assembly, coming in that way. You're actually coming in and saying, Michael, you are important. And we can do that for every single kid.
Right.
One of them has to be left out of the economy.
Right.
And that's the connecting point that if we can make that more connective, then again, it improves everything and the outcomes are just amazing.
Yeah. Recovering Kaplan guy here. So, the bell curve is part of the problem frequently where we're trying to find people who are at the top of it and the top of it across everything. When in reality, we all have different profiles, jagged talent profiles and aptitudes. Aptitude has become a slightly charged word depending on which audience you're speaking with. How do you think about that? And how do you think about the fact that some folks may not excel in the same ways, but there still likely are pathways and career needs that they should be exposed to and they should be, another area of research is everybody wants to feel like they matter. And I think there is a risk that when you focus too much on aptitude, that you can kind of make people feel the way you were feeling about your future in math. How do you think about that? How do you navigate that? Because I think it does wind up tacking very close to people's self-worth and the risk that some people feel left out.
Yeah, it's a great question. I love this question actually, because there's a lot of misunderstandings and very poorly phrased ways of thinking about aptitudes. And in fact, most of the time when people talk about aptitudes or aptitude assessments, they're actually talking about interest and personality assessments.
Hmm.
That's part of the problem right there. So aptitude assessments aren't, again, asking you your opinion about yourself, because if you do that, you actually steer people to stereotypes and biases. If it's a true aptitude assessment done based on performance metrics, then you're understanding a more holistic part of the student. And then you can add on interest and personality and other things. So by taking that combination approach, you're actually able to open up the sphere of possibilities to an individual way more than they did before, not close them down. And that's one of the misperceptions too, is that, okay, we're going to take you and we're just going to tell you exactly what you can do. And then that's your life, right? There was a movie about that years ago called Gattaca. It's a great movie. It's one of my favorites. But that's not what we do. In fact, we take it and say, okay, here's your aptitudes, and here's the myriad of ways that those aptitudes can apply to the workforce.
Right.
And we actually then rank your aptitudes against every career that we evaluate, not just one. And then we give you a breakdown of that and show you how your aptitudes line up against the norm population. Let's take me, for example. If I wanted to be an astronaut, right? That's a very common kind of stereotypical career that a young person might want to do. And I said, look, from the time I was little, I wanted to go into orbit. That's all I think about all the time. It's my greatest desire. But my aptitude assessment doesn't list that as one of my top, career choices. I can go to that career and I can actually pull it up and see how my aptitudes align with the different aptitudes that are necessary to be an astronaut. And now I'm not going blind. I can still pursue that career as hard as I possibly want. But now I know this is an area where I'm going to struggle. This is an area where I'm going to excel. And so you kind of match it up and you say, okay, I now know I'm going to have to spend a little bit more time focusing, studying, developing this new skill set.
Right.
That other people, it just comes naturally for. I think a really good example of that, Michael, is actually our education system, and it's the bell curve concept you were talking about. Counselors work with the top 10% of kids and the bottom 10% of kids. The middle 80% of the kids never get touched. Now, the 10% of the highest performing kids academically, why are they that way? Well, the true answer is most of the time is that they were naturally designed to function inside of the school environment. Their natural aptitudes lent themselves to that. And so it was kind of more natural for them. My oldest son, he is amazing. We didn't do anything to guide him, and he got straight A's the whole time. He's like the opposite of me. And he just, that's the way he was. And my second oldest, very similar to that. So it really comes down to, can we point people to larger opportunities or narrow them down? The other thing that I think is really important is don't give people scores. In this regard, scores are important at times, but they're not important at other times. What's important is feedback. Right? It's about, how do I do something? What's the information I'm getting so I can make an informed decision about how do I get better? And so in our world, we charge everything with very positive language, right? Michael, you crushed it. You're awesome, right? Because that myriad of aptitudes, which there are several, apply to you uniquely. And your career choices, or recommendations, I should say, are actually really geared towards who you are. And so we can with confidence say, Michael, if you wanted to go towards this career, we have every confidence that you would be successful because it fulfills that natural aptitude. Probably the best way to understand that is that you're born with these things, and you're born with a dominant and a non-dominant hand, right? You're born with a dominant, non-dominant eye, just depending on who you are. And as you grow and develop, you naturally start leaning towards that dominant hand, right? You start playing catch, you pick up things, you start writing better with that. And it's not, and very specifically, you can learn all of those same skills with your non-dominant hand.
Got to learn how to dribble with your left hand.
The difference is simply this. it becomes way harder for you to learn that skill with your non-dominant hand versus your dominant hand. Because you're a basketball player, using that example, yeah, you have to spend extra hours dribbling,
Right.
dribbling, where with your dominant hand, it just comes kind of natural to you.
Right.
Now put this into the context of schooling. So you're a student that has X, Y, and Z aptitudes. By the way, an aptitude is like numerical reasoning is an aptitude. 3D visualization is an aptitude. On top of that, we may put the skill of accountancy,
Right.
skill of art, right?
Right.
On top of those things.
So the skills is the next layer on top of your
That's right.
aptitudes.
Yeah. So you can always build those skills on top of whoever you are.
Mm-hmm.
So in that schooling situation now, and this becomes really critical for your success in that mentoring that you mentioned earlier. If you're building your education around your natural skills, your natural aptitudes, then if we can put you into classes that better align with those natural aptitudes, you're going to start naturally doing better in those classes, just like you picked up doing things with your dominant, non-dominant hand. Very importantly, you are actually going to feel better with your authority figure in the room, which is your teacher. And you're going to develop a closer relationship with them because they think like you, right?
Yeah.
Because they were in that career, because they kind of naturally kind of fell into it and they loved it. So now they're there. So that has this upward spiral effect that leads you to success.
Hmm.
And it's really incredibly powerful. Sometimes I'll hear comments about, well, aptitudes or assessments. This is one. Assessments don't apply equally well to all races,
Mhm.
right? Or all genders. And the truth is that's true in most cases. But the outcomes of those things are so much better when you look at it from an aptitude perspective, because we can take race completely out of it. We can take gender completely out of it. We're just looking at you and the skill that you're, the aptitude that you're performing right in front of us.
Right.
It's no bias, has no, precursor.
I guess the risk could be that people of a certain gender or race get mapped to careers that are not as remunerative or not as high status, and that's where I think it starts to get, all these conversations when you're trying to really hone in on assessment, it becomes pretty fraught, especially in this day and age. There's a lot of concern about, both over indexing on some aptitudes and or not unlocking them enough. Because the other risk is that if your aptitudes are in a space that's relevant and popping now, but it's disrupted in 5 years, can you actually over index on something where I've heard others talk about the importance of being a generalist and being flexible, adaptable, and able to kind of pivot. We're opening up a lot of topics and we're a relatively short podcast conversation here. I'm talking to Edson Barton, who's a co-founder and CEO of YouScience. Maybe taking a step back, and as we get closer to wrapping here, what are some takeaways or some ideas that you want to get out there? And also feel free to respond to anything I was just putting out there.
The concern of over-indexing on certain aptitudes actually doesn't play out in what the research says. As an example, there was a great study done out of the University of Missouri with over 7,000 different young ladies and young men. And they found that both groups had virtually identical aptitudes, right? Just smidgen, sometimes much higher or not much higher, but a little bit higher for the young women, sometimes a little bit higher, but virtually the same. When you look at their interest, though, in those areas and look at them as applied to a career, right? Career area, it's dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
Not just a little bit, but dramatically. And that's what a lot of the 2025 state of the workforce, future U.S. workforce really helps show.
Mm-hmm.
Is in that regard, young women, for example, are taking themselves out of the future economy, the economy today and the future, because they're not focusing on STEM careers still. And we've spent millions and maybe billions of dollars in the United States to try to solve that. And it's not getting much better because we're not telling young women at a young age, you are capable of this, but your aptitudes do that. and you can scientifically prove it to them.
Mm-hmm.
That makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we can actually help create that. So, if there was one thing that I would just want everybody to understand is that as we really connect to who we truly are, we actually explode open our opportunities. And it actually helps prepare us for the future, because now we're not basing our entire lives based on a concept of who I think I am at the skill level. Now I can think of myself at a much deeper level, which actually can move very, very fluidly from career to career. And the second thing that I would just say is, as we focus on career education more and more, and that doesn't have to be like always just teaching a class on welding or teaching a class on computer coding or whatever. It can be exploratory. In fact, I recommend that we do more exploratory things at the younger level. The worst comment, I think it's one of the tragedies that we've told young people, and I think you and I probably grew up in the era where we were told this emphatically: go to college and figure out what you want to do then. What a waste of time and money, right? That is just absolutely foolishness. Here, we're going to send somebody when they have huge opportunities to do so at younger ages. And now we're going to put them into college where they're paying for it, where their families go into debt for it, and they come out not knowing what they're going to do. 50% of the individuals who enroll in post-secondary drop out of school with debt, with a view of themselves and say, I'm not built for education.
Right.
Which is a lie, right? We all are. It just depends what area of education should we focus on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that we have to help our education system focus on really helping every individual find a pathway to success. And as we've talked, I've emphasized aptitudes a lot, because the results for them just are so dramatically better than any other tool. No tool is perfect out there. What's important is that we take the very best tools and apply them and stop using the ones that are ineffective. And we know that they're ineffective because they've been used for generations now and they're not producing better results. So let's move to things that are actually working and help us connect better. And we know without a doubt now, there have been so many studies done that if you help a student, a young person, identify their career path through natural ways, you're not forcing them, then all of a sudden, everything in their life gets better. That's something we should really be moving towards.
Amazing stuff today with Edson Barton, the co-founder and CEO of YouScience. We'll include a link to YouScience in the show notes for the episode. Edson, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Oh, Michael, thank you. Such wonderful questions. I love them. Such deep questions as well. Thank you.
All right. And our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed as well. If you did, please subscribe, write us a review, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.